Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour Podcast. I am Andrew Langer, your host. Joining me today, somebody as soon as I started talking about this podcast, I know I wanted to chat with. His name is Russ Vought. I'm looking down at my notes here. He's president of the Center for Renewing America. He's also the former director of the Office of Management and Budget, which to me is the best job in the federal government. Would you agree? Best job in the federal government?
I think it is the best job in the federal government.
I had a conversation with somebody. I won't even say which election cycle, but someone who had a possibility of going into the administration. And I said to this person, I said, you should put your name in for office of or OMB director. And he looked at me and said, why OMB? I said, well, first of all, if you have ambition for higher office, maybe you ought to learn how to run the government before you actually go and step in and try to run the government. Talk about what the OMB does, because I don't think a lot of people know this.
I chuckled when Secretary Pete didn't want the job because he viewed it as beneath him. But what most people realize is that it does the budget, any budget decision, any regulatory decision, all regs go through. But what people don't realize, it's all of government execution.
Yes.
So if a president is saying, I have a multi-cabinet agency initiative, that's something that's going to be largely managed through OMB to make sure all of these folks that are linking up with each other, they're not getting sideways into the various bureaucracies and TURP, and that's what we do. So in terms of all of government shutting down of critical race theory trainings to having multi-agencies and departments involved in building the wall when Congress had not provided enough resources to do that, and us finding the pots of money to do that, that's the kind of thing that OMB does.
It's one of those things where I think it partially was recognized in the general American lexicon back when David Stockman became head of the OMB. It's certainly as a teenager, less than a teenager, that's how I sort of learned about it. But in terms of being able to implement where elections matter, right? Elections matter because whoever gets elected, especially a president, is going to change the direction of government. The president is going to do that through the OMB, isn't he? Or she?
He is. And that's the critical awareness that people need to know. Is if you're a president, and FDR really pioneered how to use the former OMB, which is the Bureau budget. You're going to use OMB's statutory authorities because if you are a White House, you don't necessarily have statutory authorities to make departments do things.
Sure.
That's your ability to do that is through Office of Management and Budget. And in the past, they have been resistant. But it's about making sure there are people who know how to use OMB on behalf of a president and not letting it be in opposition to a president.
Right, and that's exactly it. I mean, it's a situation where there are a certain number of people who are political appointees who come in, and they're the ones who are supposed to change policy. But then, I've had this conversation with members of Congress. One of the problems you get is you have the entrenched bureaucracy, the career, and this is not to be a knock on career civil servants. So I'm going to bounce something off you about that. But they have their own entrenched interests, and some of them have their own ideologies that are going with them. A lot of it has to do with the overall ideology of maintaining a hold on their power, in particular bailiwicks. But this is the push-pull, isn't it? The tension between the political appointees and what the career civil servants want to do. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very subtle. It's both something that's in your face, but it's also subtle. You'll hear things, Office of Management and Budget works for the White House.
Yeah.
But you'll hear things that say, well, I don't work for the president, I work for the office of the presidency. And then you'll probe a little bit, like, what are you getting at there? And what you'll find is that there is even there a reluctance to work on behalf of the president's priorities that just were voted into office, as opposed to the office that stays there as part of a double government that's really arisen over the last 100 years, where you have kind of efficient institutions that have real power and experts, and then you have the more dignified institutions. And I've been benefited a lot of reading post my time in government about how this double government has been set up and how people have thought about it over the many years. And so it's there. It needs people to have the vision to be able to see it and to be able to unpack it. And it can be unpacked. I mean, we did some fairly consequential things at OMB to put power in the hands of the policy appointees of the president. And they came to me and said, you're going to ruin the institution. And I said, I'm not going to ruin the institution.
Yeah.
I've thought about this for a long time. I've now confirmed my theses, and I now have a conviction to go out and do this.
Talk a little bit. I know I use that phrase quite a bit, but talk a little bit about that, because I know for me, to me, listen, I shoot for the moon and be OMB director. One of the jobs that I would love to have is OIRA administrator, the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, because regulations are one of my great passions.
Yeah.
Sad as that is. But did you know, had you always thought about wanting to become OMB director? You came in as deputy, then you became, after Mick Mulvaney went up and became chief of staff. But did you always have a mind towards wanting to do this kind of work?
Yeah, I was a budget expert in the House. I wanted to get to OMB at some point. My mentor served as deputy under Bush. So OMB was always place that I was, reading up on, potentially looking to go to at some point. And so I think I had more knowledge about OMB as a policy official heading into it than anyone that I can think of. But it takes a long time to be in the institution to be able to figure out everything that's going on, which offices are really important, which ones shouldn't be important, and to really establish culture and mores that allow you to get the job done. It's
interesting because the very first time I heard someone a Republican running for president utter the phrase regulatory budgeting was in the 2016 election. Mm-hmm. And it was at that point that I really understood, because I debated Jeffrey Toobin back in 2010 and was talking about regulatory costs then, because again, I'm that kind of a nerd and passionate about those things. And the cost of regulation, there were folks in the know, sort of inside the Beltway crowd, and folks outside who were dealing with regulation directly, who knew, but it didn't really reach the popular mindset in D.C. until, I would say, after about 2012, as I said, 2016, Marco Rubio uttering the phrase regulatory budgeting. Are we now in an environment where people understand this power more than they certainly did in the past?
I think so. Yeah. And I think particularly as you have a woke and weaponized government that people are aware of, that they know that the regulations are a part of it. So what allows EPA to put a 77-year-old Navy veteran in jail for 18 months?
Right.
WOTUS.
Yeah.
And
Waters of the United States, for those who don't know.
The criminal penalties that are on the books for the bureaucracy that none of us really paid attention to when they were passed.
Sure.
And yet, so I think there's real consequences. And what we always try to do is put it in real terms. We want to be able to build things in this country. So we want an environmental policy that makes a decision on permitting within 2 years. It doesn't mean we're going to win all of those decisions, but can you at least make the decision within 2 years?
Let's to be fair, right? We in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, we had rivers literally catching on fire in America. So we have the Congress creating, through the Environmental Protection Act, the Environmental Protection Agency. We have the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, all passed before 1975. But no one's thinking about the consequences down the road. The whole point of this is to raise the cost of the bad behavior so that it becomes more expensive than the good behavior. But the end result, as you just were pointing out, is the evisceration of our manufacturing sector in America. And at some point, the needle has to return to true north, doesn't it? Talk about this.
Yeah, you can't live in a country where it takes you 30 years to build a bridge.
Right.
It's just it just doesn't pass the
laugh,
laugh
but
test.
You're right, yeah.
And so, there's things like that as well. We want to be able to make sure that cars are safe on the road, but we also want to make sure that when I put my family on the road, that I can have a certain amount of security, that they're going to be in something that's not a piece of tinfoil.
Yes.
And so, that informs how we think about the CAFE standards, which are some of the, the fuel economy standards.
Fuel economy standards, yeah.
So, one after another, we were trying to do things from the standpoint of economic pro-growth policies, but also trying to make people's lives better. And the one that's probably most famous for that is the president's interest in getting the old light bulbs back, getting dishwashers that didn't take as long to have a rinse cycle. So
and yet now we're literally just recently, depending on when this episode gets released, we have the Senate ratifying the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocols, in which they're going to essentially make older refrigerators and air conditioners illegal in America. We come back to these things. I want to go here because when the last administration came in, one of the very first things that the president did was he enunciated a couple of executive orders on regulatory transparency and accountability. The new administration comes in. Among the very first things they did was get rid of regulatory transparency and accountability, setting aside the accountability side and the adjudication, but talk about the importance of regulatory transparency, things like guidance documents and stuff that's done out of the normal process.
Sure. I mean, the regulatory process is meant to be transparent to the American people. The whole function of notice and comment
Absolutely.
is that if you are a regulated entity, that you have an opportunity to send a letter and say, this is how it impacts it. And we read those letters. The agencies read those letters. We have a lot of meetings on that. And so that's an important thing. And what the deep state has done over several decades is try to get out of that by sending a letter, doing a speech, at worst doing a blog post. All of these things are things that are like forms of guidance that they have used to then circumvent the notice and comment process. And so what we did was we basically said, President Trump did an executive order. All of this is rulemaking, so don't try to do it. Anything that OIRA says is guidance. It's coming in for regulatory reform. And it greatly empowered us to be able to keep us going in that direction. But we also wanted to take a crack at where we thought the administrative state was weaponized. And so we wanted to make sure that we were thinking through the enforcement aspects of these agencies to make sure that they weren't on autopilot. So the Department of Interior denies with kind of malicious intent the oyster farm from getting his license renewed, and next thing you know, he's out of business. Sure. So that's the kind of thing we were also focused on.
Yeah, and it's all a matter of the practicality of it. Actually, before we get to the practicality, let's talk about the real world impacts. As I was saying earlier, I was saying this elsewhere. So Donald Trump comes in, or the regulatory state is about $2.25 trillion annually, cost to the American economy. They kept it very stable because they had the 2 in 1 out. We'll get to that in a minute. Biden administration comes in. We're now back on the Obama era tempo of regulations. I think that regulatory costs are somewhere above $3 trillion annually. If we stay on this path, we're looking at $7 trillion by 2030, at least $6 trillion by 2030. Talk about the real world impact. What does that mean, a $6 or $7 trillion regulatory state to the average American? What does that mean to them?
It means higher costs. It means less options in the consumer marketplace. It means that the cost of doing business is higher for small businesses, pretty much down the line. And we were able to come in around 5 or 6 deregulatory initiatives for every one because we had that goal. But the Biden administration has been worse. In it's not just that they're bad on regulation. Bill Clinton was bad on regulation. Obama was bad on regulation. What's new is that they also gave OMB a twin mandate to make every decision not on the basis of cost-benefit analysis, but to do it on the basis of equity, which is CRT through the back door, and on the basis of climate change.
Sure.
So now instead of your cost-benefit analysis, you're now kind of putting your thumb on the scales for those two priorities that, of course, are anti-growth and anti-American.
So before they came in, before the concept of CRT, because we're going to get to this because this is what you're doing at the Center for Renewing America, there was the concept of environmental justice. And I remember a really great book in the 90s, The Promise and Peril of Environmental Justice, in which somebody had written in this book, sort of going through and talking about the importance, and then realized that there were some serious problems at work here, not the least of which was these analyses. And it gets this right, which is, so we have the Small Business Administration. We have the Office of Advocacy there. They're the only entity within the federal government that is statutorily mandated with being able to review the regulatory decisions of other agencies based upon their small business impact. And they're measuring costs. They're measuring things that are objective. But then you get this other side of it, which is this equity review, which you're right, it is a thumb on the scale. The problem, of course, is there's no objective reality to it, is there?
No. I mean, in the more you go into the details of some of these spending projects, you find that they are things like, hey, let's take a walk around the neighborhood to understand the inequitable tree canopy exposure for a particular neighborhood and what that has to do for the community and the health impacts. I mean, it's just insane.
Yes. And without and at the same time not looking at things like energy efficiency standards for HVAC equipment in inner cities and how that contributes to childhood asthma because of the shells of insects that get caught up on them and this recirculated air. Or the other one that I like to use is when you have let's say you want to site a new chemical processing refinery in a community, and by one measure, the cancer rates may go up because of possible exposure. But on the other hand, because of higher paying jobs, access to better food, access to healthcare, in fact, the rates are going to go down. You talk about cost benefit analysis. Did you do anything regarding comparative risk assessment? Because that's a whole nother issue of interest to me.
You know, it was a part of our
Yeah.
conversation throughout the process at the OIRA. I mean, our goal was to have costs on one hand
Yeah.
and benefits on
Sure.
another, and to be able to take that to the policymakers and say, make a decision.
Yeah.
Because we don't want you to be in the dark about what SBA thinks there's going to be an impact or what some important sector think is going to be.
You know, so explain the concept so that the listeners and viewers can understand. I mean, because the cost benefit analysis does what?
You are trying to say add up all of the costs.
Yes.
What are the costs? What are the health costs? What are the economic costs? What are the financial costs?
Sure.
And then you're going to do that same with the benefits.
Yeah.
And there are going to be certain benefits. There will be some health benefits
Of course.
for taking dramatic action in some area. But if you're that person in the community, have you gotten a sense of the great cost involved to be able to get some speck of PFAS out of the all fire hose material?
Sure.
I mean, that's the kind of thing. Like, yes, there in a lot, if there's a ton of PFAS, just to use one particular
Sure.
example, and you put it all in one water bottle, yeah, you don't want to drink it.
Of course. Yes.
But does that mean that one speck means that the entire community needs to be overhauled so that there can be no presence?
Why? You know, it's funny because I worked on a project in the 90s with the National Environmental Policy Institute, and it was a reinventing EPA project, and one of the sectors of it was how clean is clean. How come we can't have a rational discussion in America about how clean something needs to be? You know, why do we need to go down this road of the nth degree of you have to be able to eat a tablespoon of dirt every day for 50 years without, getting cancer?
Because it gets politicized.
Yeah.
And what I found is that we had, our career staff were not inerrant by
Yeah.
any stretch, but they were some of the folks that were trying to say, from a position of data, the level that they are trying to get to in terms of not having a particular presence of a particular chemical
Yeah.
is so far above what is necessary. But you couldn't do that because you'd have these movies out there with Mark Ruffalo, and that's driving
Yes.
the senators to say absolutely not.
The Aaron Brockovich effect. She puts
Exactly.
on a tight shirt and talks about hexavalent chromium, and all of a sudden America
All of a sudden,
goes,
it's,
yeah,
15
America goes
senators
crazy.
are demanding it.
Yes, yeah. Bo Derek goes up to the Hill to talk about the killing of wild horses.
Wild
and all.
horses,
Yes, yes.
right. And in that particular example, now we can't deal with the fact that all these horses are starving on the open plain, and
Right.
there's nothing we can do about it.
So what was the biggest? You're going to OMB. That was your first experience going to the administration.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the most eye-opening thing about that? Coming off the Hill, the biggest contrast.
The degree of detail.
Okay.
So on the Hill, you think that you're dealing with a level of detail that is pretty deep. But the extent of and the granularity and the smallness of these issues
Sure.
that you can get hung up on behalf of for 2 weeks.
I had so when I was teaching on these issues, and I've taught on the regulatory process before. One of the first things I do is I have my students go to regulations.gov, which is a tremendous innovation. For those of you who don't know, regulations.gov is a website where you can go and see regulatory proposals and comment on them in a relatively easy and straightforward fashion. And I'd have them go. It was one of their first assignments to go and pull any regulatory proceedings, comments that are due in the next 7 days, or regulatory proceedings that opened up in the previous 7 days, and summarize them, talk about the agencies, talk about the issues. And the idea was to give my students an idea of the breadth of decision making. So whether or not it's Department of the Interior talking about some habitat for a flying squirrel, to waters of the United States, to the schedule of opening up of a drawbridge on the intercoastal waterway down in Florida. And it blew their minds, the level of granularity with which the federal government was getting involved in things. The federal government wasn't meant to do all these things, was it?
No, and it gets even beyond that. You'll tie to some particular standard that's in law, which is an acronym, and then you got to think through, the law is written so that if there's 75% towards that standard, all of a sudden you're now over the line, and you got to really think that through, in real world. And you're dealing with a staff that never actually gives you a memo that gives you things in as you and I would be able to think through it in the real term. It is all kind of bureaucraties
Sure.
in that always reminded me of when Rumsfeld told his staff, I don't want to ever see acronyms again.
Sure, yeah.
And so you're dealing with that, and you've got to kind of triangulate to be able to think through what are the real life implications of this, because your team of experts largely do not want to communicate that. They want to stay on the plane of just expertise and kind of spit out the answers from the magic 8-ball.
You know, it's funny because I as the pandemic was happening, I want to talk about your experience during the pandemic.
Do we have to?
No, we don't. But my point is, I had a meeting when I was lobbying for small business. I was working for NFIB. I had a meeting with folks from DHS and HHS about when they were talking about bird flu. Remember when bird flu was the big thing, and what would happen if they had to shut down small businesses in America for 2 weeks? And I said, well, they go out of business. It's just that simple. I mean, if you shut them down, we didn't learn that lesson then. But again, it gets down to the bureaucrats not. Again, I don't like to use that term. Career civil servants, not sort of understanding how what little bit of burden they might be adding adds to the overall burden, and B, sort of not understanding the burdens that are already out there. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I joke on it because it was one of the most eye-opening, frustrating parts of my time in government, serving on the COVID task force, seeing kind of the ways that the public health agencies participate in the larger policy process. And it's not good. I mean, you have an agency like CDC, thousands of its employees. Bob Redfield had maybe 3 employees that were actually policy officials, and they're expected to manage the entirety agency.
Astounding.
Not possible.
Yeah.
But I'll just give you an example to your question. We had a COVID task force meeting, and this was weeks into it when we were starting to see the impact of the lockdowns that the states were doing. And all of us economic guys went in there and walked them through the economic impact of what they were doing. In particular, Kudlow and Kevin Hassett did, a tour de force.
Sure.
Where we just said 20, 30 minutes, this is what you need to know. And I remember all of the public health guys looking very attentively, very, very respectful. The minute the conversation was over, okay, why are beaches open? Why is it that we haven't come down like a ton of bricks on the local parlor, the tattoo parlor in Georgia? I mean, that is the kind of stuff that I saw, and it was maddening.
Sure.
Because you didn't have enough of the science guys in the COVID to be able to beat back their nonsense really until Scott Atlas.
And obviously, there was no understanding of the impact of what printing huge amounts of money to give to people, right? Because I mean, it was one of those things where during the pandemic, during the spring of 2020, right? To me, it was a very simple constitutional issue, right? The federal government was causing, and then the state governments were causing all of these businesses to shut down. This is a taking, to me, in violation of the Fifth Amendment. The federal government owes compensation. That's one thing, but on the other hand, this idea that we're going to print massive amounts of money, I get the sense that these public health officials certainly never thought about the ongoing economic consequences. Am I right in thinking about this?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, they viewed it as a feature, not as a bug, because people were at home and not, in contact with each other, and trying to think through from a trade-off perspective. Okay, let's isolate the older, sick, at-risk populations.
Sure.
And they would always come back. Deb Burks would say, well, that's not foolproof. Well, we know it's not foolproof. We're living in an imperfect world with trade-offs, and we don't want to have all these mom-and-pop shops shutting down.
Yeah.
And so, and I agree with you. I mean, I hate bailouts. I was very against TARP, for instance,
Sure.
but I always viewed what we were doing as from a takings perspective. Yeah. If we're going to shut down the whole country, particularly the states, we break it, we buy it. We got to be able to fill these tanks up.
Yeah, I used to like to refer to TARP as BARF, the Bad Asset Relief Fund. Right. It was just one of those pithy things that went out there. So let's shift our gears a little bit. Let's talk about life after OMB. You come out, you take over this organization, the Center for Renewing America. I looked down at my notes again to make sure I got it. Talk about the work that you guys are doing there.
Well, we had a laundry list of things I wanted to do in the administration with a second term, but there was also huge paradigm shifts that I wanted to tackle, that I thought the conservative movement needs to reflect on, that I thought Donald Trump brought to office.
Sure.
That is one of the reasons we've not been able to beat back the left. I mean,
Yeah.
why are we on the cusp of losing our country? It's because we have not fought in the terrain that the left has been
Sure.
militant about. That, and so I wanted an organization that picked the fights in the cultural battles, had a kind of an OMB know-how credibility to tack them. We learned to execute under withering fire, so we could be a place that could provide not just credible information and know-how, but here's how you do it without getting blown up.
Yeah.
So, you're going to get called the names. You're going to get
Sure.
called bigot, racist, Christian nationalist, but we're going to show you that you can plow through it, have a career, and not get canceled, and we're going to be an institution that helps do that. And so whether that is immigration, on securing the border, and we've got a plan to do that for state governors to do it while Biden can't, to critical race theory, towards attacking the deep state. And that was really where we are going to go, and we're scaling up right now to be able to go after all of woke and weaponized government, because it's a fiscal issue, but it's a security issue because the country is no longer safe from the government.
Talk about the fiscal side of it, which to me I think gets into the lack of objective reality that's at work. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. If you don't have objective reality to base a policy on, then it opens up the door, Katie barred the door in terms of what can happen. Am I right or wrong there?
You are. I mean, I think we're in fiscal danger waters right
Yeah.
now, and inflation has reared its head. We all knew it would.
Sure.
D.C. and the policy community was in la-la land over the last 10 years, and they were in a la-la land because the Fed could raise interest on excess reserves and keep it in check.
Sure.
But when you're coming out of the kind of economic shock that we just experienced, there's going to be a higher rate out there that you could go and get. And so as a result of that, the fundamentals have returned. And unfortunately, you don't know when you're going to hit a crisis when we're talking about these types of fiscal crises. You don't know when you've gone over and now you have a currency. Currency's doing fine for right now. But that's the problem that we're going to face, is if we don't get our fiscal house in order, we're going to be looking at some serious problems down the road. Hopefully we don't lose our status as the reserve currency.
You spent a goodly amount of time up on the Hill. And it's one of these situations where Congress could take great steps in this by reining in the power of the executive branch. Nobody seems to want to do that. I mean, that was one of the fascinating things about the Trump administration was Trump said when he was running, I'm going to shrink the size and scope of the federal government, which to me, I was skeptical because I'd heard that promise made before and seen it not done. But why is it? I mean, is it just as simple as regardless of which side you're on, you want your side to be able to have that power when they come to office?
No, I think it's because we don't understand the complexity of the problem. It's not just an Article 1, Article 2 issue.
Okay.
It is a blend of the two. And so when you have certain parts of Congress continue to be empowered, committee barons, congressional leadership, senators who can block nominees, those are the ones that are listened to by the administrative state. So they care quite a bit about where the appropriators are. The appropriators have massive power.
Sure.
So from an Article 1 perspective, they have, I think, more power than they should.
Interesting.
But of course, we know there's something fundamentally broken about Congress. They're all backbenchers. Everyone who's not in the group that I just mentioned has no power whatsoever. They're discouraged, and they are treated, because they are, as backbenchers who have no power. And guess who joins them with them? The President of the United States.
Yes, yeah.
And so you have this weird regime that is kind of over the lines of demarcation in the Constitution between the branches that make it hard to figure out how to deconstruct it. That's one of the things that we are about to try to change the paradigms, because at times it means Congress needs to reassert itself.
Sure.
It needs to be very clear about not giving legislative powers to an agency.
Right, the waters of the United States
Make
issue.
the trade-off on the floor of the House and the Senate. Don't make me and Andrew Wheeler and Dan Brouillette have to decide what the right balance of ethanol is in gasoline. We shouldn't have to spend months of our life working on that. That should be done on the House floor. So that's a clear Article 1, take back the power.
Okay.
But for instance, Congress shouldn't say you have to spend every last dollar of our appropriations.
Yeah.
Because what happens? At the end of the fiscal year,
Use it
people
or lose
use it or lose it.
Yeah.
You end up buying flat TVs
Yes.
and copy machines.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's fundamentally broken because those ones are listening to the Appropriations Committee chairman.
Yeah, no, I get that entirely. Let's talk about this because there's the other issue, which is the establishment. And I don't like using necessarily the phrase establishment versus disruptors, but there is certainly an establishment class in D.C. and they are the ones calling. And I guess this is more or less what you're talking about in terms of the folks who are the committee barons and the backbenchers. I mean, is that what we're talking about here, or is it?
That's fair. I mean, I call it more of a political cartel.
Okay.
Where even the uniparty, mostly Republicans on the side, will take policy objective points off of the board.
Yeah.
Because they have risk involved. So they would rather have not risk and have status quo. That doesn't mean they're not trying to accomplish policy objectives.
No.
It's just up to the point of their risk tolerance.
Do they? Time out for a second. Do they not understand that there's risk inherent in not risking things?
I don't think that they have a long term.
Okay, got it.
5-10 years. So I don't think they look at it and say, if we continue to tick off our voters,
right,
our voters will hate us.
Sure.
And I think that's what you've seen on the Republican side, and I think to some extent you saw that on the Democrat side as they went towards the squad.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that, Newt Gingrich always used to say, the establishment is those who kind of accomplish their policy objectives within the constraints of the system.
Yes.
Anti-establishment were those who said, we're going to accomplish our policy objectives, and then we'll change the system accordingly.
Sure. But now you have so many different aspects of that system joining together, right? I don't think anybody ever envisioned quite in the same way. I'm sorry. Again, going back to, because we can make the comparisons to the Johnson administration or the Nixon administration in terms of the use of law enforcement agencies, for instance, as instruments of political power. We're now back to that in a way that we hadn't seen in a very long time. How did we get back here to that situation?
Well, the left, the media went from Walter Cronkite's liberalism to flat out, we are the media organ of the regime.
Sure.
And so outside of a handful of networks, that's what you're getting.
Yeah.
And so, that ruling class values milieu has also been a part of not only the institutions, but the nonprofits, the Congress, the media. They're all together without a lot of black and white dividing lines that says, if you believe that Donald Trump is the end of all democracy, by which they just is code for their oligarchy, if you believe that he must be stopped at all costs, then you're going to do everything you can, including break the rules in the law and weaponize agencies to stop him.
Do you think that and I don't mean anti-Donald Trump as though they're against Donald Trump, but the folks who are running for president on the Republican side in 2024, who are styling themselves as Trump alternatives, do you think that they don't realize that it doesn't matter how they style themselves, the media and others are going to paint them? They're not going to paint them as Donald Trump. They're going to paint them as worse than Donald Trump. Do you think they miss this?
I think some do.
Okay.
I think that there's a segment of the country of the Republican side that wants an alternative to Donald Trump. I think it's a small one, but I think it's heavy on the elite side that doesn't realize the fight that we're in. They really think this is about Donald Trump's Twitter account, and it's not. It is about that other side hates people like me.
Yeah.
They want to cancel us,
Yeah.
and they want to cancel you. And whoever is the president, if they are actually fighting, is going to be the type of person that's standing in the way of that. And the only way out of that box is compromiser to be the controlled opposition. And I think that's, what I'm not sure everyone that has their vision set on the White House, and I don't want to get into specifics, has in mind when they are thinking through, maybe I could be the president and serve well.
Well, this because I have somebody in mind as well. So before we get back to what you guys are doing at the Center for Renewing America, it's January, I don't know when the inauguration is going to be. Let's say January 21, 2025. Any Republican has won the White House. They are inaugurated. What is the very first thing, besides appointing you once again as OMB director? I don't know if you want it again. But what's the very first policy thing that president should do in order to start to set the ship right?
Well, I think we're working on what those policy initiatives should be. I think definitely one of them is Schedule F, is something that has given him the ability to provide the career officials who do policy to make them at-will employment.
Got it.
Massively important. I think that has to be one of those first-day actions. But I think that there is something at each agency that needs to be signed to be able to give each agency head the moral high ground to seize control. For instance, when I was at OMB, it took one of the convictions I developed was that policy appointees actually had to be the ones that signed the apportionments about whether an agency can spend money.
Got it.
For 50, 60 years, honestly 100 years since the Bureau of the Budget was given that authority, that was all career officials.
Yeah.
And we took that away and we put that in our hands.
Sure.
And as a result, we saw everything. And
Yeah.
when we saw, we were like, man, we now know what's going on in these agencies. And when the career comes and says you're going to ruin your agency, you got to either have a conviction yourself or an order from the president.
Right,
and we want to make sure that there's enough orders from the president.
Grover Norquist had long put out the idea, and this is comprehensive regardless of the level of government, but he thinks that every government-issued credit card should have its credit card statements being put online somewhere, which is a weird little fix, but right? I mean,
it could help. I mean, we
couldn't
struggle.
hurt, certainly.
It couldn't hurt. We're always looking for ways for abuse, on the smallest of things. But they get these furniture budgets, and then they go and just spend it all on furniture. I mean, it's just nonsense.
Which interestingly enough, right? If you're an agency head and you do that, like what was it, Zinke, I guess it was, who Secretary Zinke, who had that happen. So Center for Renewing America, you guys are working on CRT. Talk a little bit more about that.
We're trying to create big national cultural fights, win those debates at the national level, and let the momentum flow at every level of government. So the biggest one that we've been is trying to declare what's happening at the border invasion.
Sure.
We're very supportive of efforts on big tech reform and making sure that they get back in their box.
Yeah.
We are very active on election integrity. Looking back, today we just filed 2 complaints with the IRS to say that what Zuckerberg did in the last election is really a violation of the law as it pertains to C3 status and that they should lose their tax exempt. But we're taking the principle of that, applying it to the future and what we think the left is doing to innovate, which is to say taxpayer dollars are being used to voter register, but it's just partisan get out the vote activity. And then the big place that we're scaling to is to be active on all woke and weaponized government.
Good.
And I'll be doing a budget in November to show how you get to balance in an America First way.
I love it. Love the idea. So let's as we were talking about before you came on the air. So I've had this idea. I've explained it on a couple of different podcasts now. Wanted to do a standalone podcast called Outside Interests because I think it's important for people to understand. And we just have spent a good, almost 40 minutes talking about public policy, which I am passionate about. I love. But there are things, the people who engage in this policy, they have other outside interests. And so I had a conversation with a congressman who's into music in a big way and other folks who are into cooking and things like that. So we're going to get to Yankee baseball in a second, but talk a little bit about some of your other outside interests. I mean, your wife, Mary, is also involved in the policy side of things and the political side of things, but talk about this.
Yeah, my life outside of work, first of all, work is pretty much a huge part of what we do. We're trying to save the country, but it's family, it's church, teaching Sunday school, love to read, would love to read on so many different subjects, and then following sports that I love, Yankee baseball being first and foremost.
And some amazing news, again, because we don't when we're going to release this, we don't want to get into specifics. So you grew up in New York. Any particular memories? You remember the first time you went to Yankee Stadium?
Mid '80s. The first big memory I have was in 1987 when there was a 7-0 deficit against the Twins.
Okay.
And I was there with my best friend, and they actually came back in the aftermath of the 7th inning. So that's kind of indelibly marked in my mind. But there's a lot of happy memories.
So I went to Fan Appreciation Day in '78. Awesome. And it was right after the Yanks had won the series in '77. Thurman Munson was still alive. We're going to get to your favorite Yankee in a second. And that was when they introduced the Reggie Bar. I don't know if you're familiar with Reggie Bar. And unfortunately, some boneheaded play happened on the field, and all of a sudden fans began throwing Reggie Bars on the field.
Yep.
But I found my Fan Appreciation mug. It's on a shelf in my house. You have a favorite Yankee of all time?
Don Mattingly.
Don Mattingly, of course,
But it's funny you mentioned that. So I'm the youngest of 7, so everyone else is about 10 years older. So they all were in the 70s.
Okay.
And then I had the desert years of the 80s.
Of course, early 80s,
we really had only Mattingly, and that's it.
That's right.
But it was fun to then be able to experience some of the winning after that.
Yeah, for me, Like I know where I was when I found out Thurman Munson died. Thurman Munson is my favorite Yankee of all time. He's a Yankee catcher who died in a plane crash in the summer of '79, and it was like my JFK assassination. I mean, it was devastating to me as a kid. Paul O'Neill, in terms of my mind, I mean, obviously everybody loves Derek Jeter and other Paul O'Neill as far as modern Yankees go.
Yeah.
When Paul O'Neill left the Yankees, something was changed. In your adult life, any particular fond memories of getting? I mean, have you been to the new stadium?
Yeah, I don't like the new. I don't like the new stadium as much. It's fine.
Sure.
I love going to a Yankee game,
Yeah.
but the old stadium had something special about it. The best adult memory was 2001. They'd come back in the divisional series, back from down 2 on the road, come back to Yankee Stadium, and my friend and I get tickets to sit in the they were relatives of Tim Hudson, so we get seats in the A section, but we have to be quiet.
Sure, of course.
So I got Jason Giambi's dad's next to me.
Nice.
And I got to be quiet for the entirety of the game, but it was an awesome experience. The place is shaking. So
that is unbelievable. We took the family to the new stadium a few years back. Haven't been back since. Saw the Yanks. It's funny. I have a daughter who's gotten really into baseball, both major league and minor league. And took her to see the Yanks at the O's in July, just the two of us, and we wound up sitting right behind the Yankee dugout, where all the Yankees fans were. It was an amazing experience. Have you brought your kids to a game?
Yeah, they're very interested in it, particularly watching on television. They know all the players, 10 and 8-year-olds.
Yeah.
The games are a little long for them.
Yeah, well, yes.
And so
they're a little long for everybody.
We're trying to get to the outer innings.
Listen, I loved going, and the great thing about going to Camden Yards is that you can get seats for relatively inexpensive. It's much less expensive to go to Yankee Stadium. But when the Yanks were blowing out the O's, I was like, all right, honey, it's 7th inning. We can get out here and beat the traffic.
Exactly.
Beat the traffic back home. Listen, Russ, how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing?
AmericaRenewing.com, and you can get me on all the channels at Russ Vought.
Russ, thank you so very much for joining us today. Thank you all very much for joining us today. This has been yet another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour. Enjoy the rest of your lunch. See you next week.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.